the real Salem witch trial lie. It wasn't witchcraft, it was land and money. The sheriff's men were already in the field when the screaming started, cattle driven off, doors pried open, a ledger of fees in a pocket. The warrant said witchcraft. The cart said hay, corn, and a family's winter. Get this, nobody asked where that hay ended up or who signed the bill. We're told Salem was about curses and cats, but follow the receipts and the boundaries and a different ghost steps out. Debt. Neighbors turned rivals. Accusations that landed on the richest edges of town, and a court that let invisible specters become very real lien. Here are the stakes: farms stripped clean, widows hounded for jail costs, children parceled out, generational wealth erased and reassigned. We're going to track who accused, who paid, and who quietly collected. To see the scam, we go back past the gallows, past the sermons, to a line on a map that never stopped moving, and a village that refused to be just a suburb of its town. The map that lies. Salem Village versus Salem Town. The story starts with one place pretending to be two. On paper, it's Salem. In practice, it's Salem Town on the coast, ships, merchants, tax lists, and Salem Village inland, a scatter of farms nursing soil and grudges. Same name, different worlds. The town paid its ministers with trade and promises. The village paid with corn and resentment. While that was happening in Salem Town's counting houses, upcountry families were fighting over where Salem ended and Topsfield began, and whose grandfather's grant outranked a neighbor's newer deed. What nobody knew at the time, or pretended not to, was how those map lines would funnel fear into assets. The village wanted its own church and its own budget. That meant hiring a minister and paying him. Parsonage fields mattered, land meant salary. When the village called ministers and then starved them of pay, every missed pound was a fresh wound. Nobody kept score like farmers, and nobody took score like the Putnam. The Putnams sat where pasture met timber and disputes met courtrooms. They were land-rich and cash-poor, always suing, always defending, always watching whose fence posts shifted. Third-generation Thomas Putnam Jr. learned early that papers could do what fences couldn't, pin a neighbor to a boundary. Meanwhile, coastal Salem's elite tracked debts and cargo lists. Between them sat the parsonage, a house that doubled as an unpaid bill. Remember, this is the late 1680s into 1692. The colony's charter had been revoked in 1684 and only replaced in 1692 with a new, weaker charter under royal control. Laws were in limbo, taxes were unpopular, war on the main frontier was bleeding men and money out of Essex County. Villagers argued over who had to fund guard rotations and whether the town's tax demands made sense when the church was barely paid for. Ministers came and went through that parsonage like a revolving door, each one stepping into a fight over pounds of salary and cords of wood. One minister's story sketches the pattern. George Burroughs took the village pulpit, then left under a cloud of unpaid wages and borrowed funeral money. When he returned to settle accounts, a Putnam had him arrested for the debt. That feud didn't fade. Years later, when the girls saw specters, Burroughs' name was ready to be written down. Debt became doctrine. Meanwhile, boundary lines were becoming weapons. Topsfield and Salem Village had argued for years. The town family, Rebecca Nurse, Mary Esty, Sarah Cloyce, was rooted in Topsfield. The Putnams were Salem Village muscle. In the 1680s, the towns and their allies caught Putnams cutting timber where Topsfield said the line barred Salem hands. Lawsuits flew. Each deposition layered onto the next. By 1692, those same names resurfaced in a new ledger, arrest warrant. Here, where the map lies. It pretends to be neutral. But if your farm sat along a contested border, your name sat closer to danger. If your pasture blocked a preferred road, or your woodlot lay between a creditor and the shortest path to payment, your piety wouldn't save you. The village's quarrel with the town was about authority, yes, but also about who could turn prayer into control of fields. The parsonage salary debates weren't theology, they were mortgages in disguise. Every rate voted at the meeting house meant reaching into a neighbor's bin. Now remember, families weren't passive. They hired surveyors, gathered witnesses, and filed suits. Thomas Putnam Jr. learned the rhythms of court like a trade. He understood that a complaint, well-timed, well-signed, could tilt a negotiation. When accusations started, he and his household were in the room. And Putnam SR and Ann Jr. gave the words shape. The network around them gave those words a route into jail cells. Meanwhile, in Salem Town, merchants watched frontier war ruin markets. Ships went to sea, but fear dried up credit. The town's men needed order. The village needed a win. In that tension, the oldest tool in New England came right back out. Make the invisible world do the visible world's work. If legal titles were messy and the old charter revoked with nothing stable in place until 1692, specters could move faster than surveyors. Here, S where the parsonage fits again. The village's minister, Samuel Paris, lived in the center of those salary battles. His household became the stage where affliction began. The girls' fits weren't random. They erupted exactly in the home where money and status were strapped tight. And the first targets after enslaved Tituba, women at the edges of property fights and social friction. From there, the map of accusations widened along paths of land and rivalry. We need to pause on how taxes tied to land created enemies out of neighbors. To pay the minister, to pay guards, to pay court officers, the village levied rates based on acreage and goods. If you refused, you weren't just stubborn, you were subverting the church, the court, the peace. That language gave cover to squeeze harder. Men who sat on committees set the rates, then signed the writs when you fell behind. You'll recognize this rhythm. Those who set the rules also cashed the receipt. While that was happening in the meeting house, across the fields, a farmer wrote his will a little earlier than he might have liked. People like Giles Corey shifted land to heirs before death, wary of what a conviction could strip. Sheriff George Corwin's men seized goods illegally from some estates anyway, billing jail fees to families who already had nothing left. A map can't show a cow stolen at dusk, but those cows are the trial's footprint in real life. The irony? The village was fighting to be more independent from the town, but the way it fought, using courts, rates, and accusations, made it more dependent on outside authority to certify each move. That's how a boundary fight cracked open a path for a special court with looser rules. Lines on a map, names on a tax roll, signatures on a minister's salary. By 1692, they'd braided into a rope. The lesson sits right there in the geography. Wherever money and land were unclear, fear offered a shortcut. And the people who knew the map best knew how to steer the panic. The Putnams, Playbook. While the map was lying, the Putnams were writing. Their paper wasn't parchment. It was petitions, depositions, and writs, a stack high enough to fence a pasture. Land rich and cash poor, the clan lived on margins, timber to sell, fields to lease, debts to juggle. Thomas Putnam Jr. grew up hearing suits before sermons. He learned that if money is slow, law can move it. Stakes first. If you were a neighbor on the wrong side of a fence line, the Putnams could make your quiet dispute into a public case. In Essex courts, they'd pressed for boundaries, inheritance shares, and unpaid notes for years. That habit mattered in 1692 because accusations needed roots. Thomas knew the clerks, the forms, the pace. He knew which signatures made a magistrate lean forward. Action, the pattern shows up in filings. Thomas Jr. wrote and co-signed dozens of complaints that spring, a kind of accusation engine. He brought not just his voice, but his household. And Putnam Sr., sharp with local memory, and Ann Putnam Jr., 12 and central to the afflictions, formed the conversational hub of the crisis. Their kitchen became an intake desk. Girls from allied families cycled through with fits and names. Men wrote those names down. When Ann Jr. cried that a specter pinched or choked Thomas Jr., turned that cry into paper. Meanwhile, Ann Sr. amplified detail, history, grudges folded in. The net widened the way a merchant nets a harbor, patiently, then all at once. Impact, each complaint drew constables, fees, and jail bills. Arrest strained a rival's household. Livestock went unattended, planting slipped. Confessions, often wrung from the terrified, named new people, many of whom were already on the wrong side of the Putnams in land or parish politics. The spiral didn't feel random, it felt directed. Here's a micro-story. In 1683, when George Burroughs returned to settle accounts, a Putnam had him arrested over a funeral debt. That's a line item in a ledger, but it marks a relationship. Creditor over debtor. Fast forward to 1692, and the Putnam women say his specter strangles them. The unpaid note becomes a moral failing. The moral failing becomes a capital crime. That's not witchcraft, that's leverage. Another beat. Rebecca Nurse's family had squared off against the Putnams and their allies over timber and borders. In the 1680s, they'd sued after catching Putnam men cutting on land Topsfield claimed. Those depositions taught both sides how to talk in court. When Nurse was accused, Thomas Putnam's network could meet petitions with affidavits, sympathy with suspicion. Her initial acquittal was overturned after the afflicted protested in open court. And Jr. cried and the jury reversed. A boundary dispute found its most brutal judge. What nobody outside the village saw clearly was the Putnams' cash problem. The estate of Thomas Sr. had been substantial on paper but chopped by bequests and obligations. Thomas Jr. inherited expectations, lawsuits, and pride. He was the kind of neighbor who counted cords of wood owed to the parsonage, but also counted cords owed to him. In a year when war, taxes, and a confused charter squeezed everyone, he used the tool he had, process. There was also the matter of heirs and alliances. The Putnams married into families that sat on committees and juries. They weren't alone, other clans did the same, but they were unusually persistent. Watch the petitions that spring. When a proctor or a nurse tried to rally signatures, a Putnam ally supplied counterstatements. When a magistrate hesitated, another fit closed the gap. The household voice, mother and daughter, made the fear vivid. The family's legal muscle made it actionable. Meanwhile, Thomas Jr.'s written complaints show a wide range. Servants like Mercy Lewis in his orbit, neighbors with whom he'd traded land, rivals in parish votes. Mercy herself had fled frontier war to end up in the Putnam house, a refugee who owed room and safety to the family now naming enemies. That's a powerful alignment, trauma, dependence, and a ready audience. It multiplied accusations with a cadence that tracked with old fights. Now the court enters and the playbook tightens. Spectral evidence was contested even then, but in June 1692 the emergency court accepted it, enabled by the post-1684 power vacuum and a hurried new charter that left evidentiary standards pliable. The Putnams' words gained force disproportional to proof. Thomas's habit of paper pushing met judges eager to move cases. The result was speed. Warrants, examinations, indictments stacked like cordwood. Each step triggered costs that landed on the accused and their spouses. Sheriff George Corwin's men assessed fees, impounded goods. Families negotiated from fear. Titles cleaned under duress. Here's the impact that lingers. The Putnams didn't need to buy your farm outright. They could weaken you until a boundary agreement favored them, until a disputed road served their lot, until your heirs sold cheap. Even where they didn't gain acreage, they gained position. Rivals' voices quieted. Petitioners left jail poorer. The parish faction aligned with the Putnams set the minister's terms. Was it all design? People in 1692 believed in witchcraft, and the Putnams were no exception. But belief doesn't erase benefit. In the ledger of outcomes, their network's enemies bore more risk, and their allies bore less. That's not coincidence, that's a system. And the household at the center, a father who knew the clerk's desk, a mother who knew the village's grudges, a daughter whose suffering the court would trust, wasn't just swept by the storm. They steered it. The court that wanted specters, while the Putnams were turning fear into paperwork, the government was breaking apart and reassembling. The old colonial charter was gone. The new one arrived with William Phipps in 1692 and a to-do list longer than the coast. With jails already stuffed from months of examinations and no legislature-ready legal code for witchcraft after the 1684 charter's revocation, and before the 1692 replacement settled authority, Phipps reached for speed. He created a special tribunal, oyer and terminer, to hear and determine, and handed the gavel to William Stoughton. Stakes first. When you build a court in a vacuum, the rules you choose decide who loses their home. If the standard becomes loose enough to catch a shadow, it can catch a farm. With the province's finances strained by frontier war and unrest, velocity looked like virtue. Speed meant fees collected, dockets cleared, and the appearance of order. Action. In June, the court opened in Salem. Bridget Bishop stood first. What passed for evidence was the visible suffering of the afflicted, their bodies writhing, claiming her specter pinched and strangled. Ministers were divided, but magistrates like John Hathorne had already set the tone in pre-court hearings. Press hard, accept the unseen as proof if enough mouths repeated it. The court didn't invent spectral evidence, but it gave it teeth. Confessions counted. 2 witnesses to an occult act counted. But the reliable, repeatable currency was specter talk. Because it was always available, it traveled fast, and it named names. Meanwhile, something else was happening in Boston's corridors. The new charter had shifted who held power. Phipps was juggling military demands and political debts. Stoughton, steeped in providential thinking and allied with elite interests, was the tribunal's engine. He valued decisiveness. Every objection to spectral admissions looked, to his eye, like delay. What nobody knew at the time, or chose to ignore, was how this rule set dovetailed with local agendas. A system that privileged the afflicted's visions over corroborated facts turned social capital into legal capital. If your circle could produce synchronized fits, your enemies faced shackles. If your pastor's circle wrote careful cautions, Increase and Cotton Mather urged restraint, not prohibition, the line stayed blurry. Proceed with caution sounds prudent until you're the one paying jailer's fees while the court cautions its way to hanging day. This was the moment everything changed. June to August became a machine. Warrants led to examinations where the afflicted convulsed on cue. Touch tests proved diabolical influence when a fingertip calmed a spasm. Poppets and odd moles were paraded as marks of Satan. Confessors, many poor, many terrified, were rewarded with survival if they named more witches. That created supply. Each new name generated new arrests, new fees, new frozen estate. Impact: the court's design carried consequences beyond the gallows. The sheriff's office billed prisoners for irons, food, and transport. Think roughly 2.5 shillings per week for diet, enough to drain a poor family's cash in a month. When families couldn't pay, officers, George Corwin chief among them, seized goods. Even where law didn't permit forfeiture on conviction, practice bit first and asked permission later. Estate inventories paused in mid-breath. Creditors hovered, wondering which claims would survive an attainder and which would vanish with a neck snap. Unknown to them, across town, merchants were cataloging loss from the northern wars and looking for signals that the government could act. The court's pace became that signal. 20 dead by autumn, dozens still indicted, and a public whipped by spectacle. Stoughton's court allowed what steadier courts had hesitated to admit, and that permission magnified the Putnam network's voice. Accusations landed heavier when a judge was ready to stamp them. Meanwhile, clergy hedged. The return of the ministers urged caution about specters, but didn't slam the door. In sermons, some framed the crisis as a test of communal purity. That gave Stoughton cover. He could say he heeded ministers while still accepting the afflicted's descriptions as actionable. The result was a legal theater where theological debate met economic reality. Every day in jail cost money. Every conviction threatened a household's balance sheet. You'll recognize this rhythm. Lower the proof bar during a crisis, and the billable process expands to fill the gap. There was one problem the court couldn't paper over. Spectral evidence made guilt untestable. If the devil could take your shape without consent, then your denial meant nothing. If he couldn't, then specters proved a pact. The court behaved as if the second were settled truth. That assumption turned doubt into treason. Juries were pushed to see what only a circle of girls claimed to see. The ripple effect spread. Magistrates tied to elite families cemented alliances through roles in examinations and juries. Constables earned by the warrant. Keepers earned by the week. The general court's absence from early lawmaking amplified Stoughton's discretion. In that gap, the tribunal behaved like a revenue and order machine, even if nobody called it that aloud. In the aftermath of each hanging day, the ledger entries mattered as much as the sermons. Bodies cut down, relatives petitioned for remains, bills presented. Estates of the executed were held in limbo. Widows negotiated with men who just condemned their spouses. The court's appetite for specters had fed an ecosystem of cost and control. And by August, the machine was starting to eat people the elite knew, like former Minister George Burroughs, on evidence no sturdier than a fit and a rumor of feats of strength. The court wanted specters because specters moved. They moved faster than surveyors, faster than Parliament, faster than a new legal code could be drafted. And in a year when power needed to look decisive, invisible testimony made visible authority. The price was paid in fields left unharvested, inventories marked, seized, and a village taught that fear could outvote fact. Who got accused V's, who got paid? While the court chased specters, the ground told a simpler story. Look at a parish map from 1692 and shade the contested edges. The Topsfield-Salem village border, the road corridors toward Salem town, the best mill access. Now overlay the arrest lists. The clusters aren't random. Names like Nurse, Esty, Howe Wild's anchor that northern belt where Putnam claims pressed hardest and timber rights meant cash. Further south, where roads funneled carts toward the port, outspoken traders like the Englishes landed in irons. The sweep of accusation followed useful land and valuable routes. Stakes first. If your farm touched a disputed line, you lived with suits, surveyors, and late-night arguments over tree stumps that supposedly marked a grant. If your pasture fronted a road the village wanted widened or redirected, your front fence was leverage. An accusation didn't need to seize your deed outright. It froze your choices. While you sat in Salem jail paying for bread and irons, planting windows passed. Creditors tapped their feet. Heirs argued in whispers. Action cross-referenced the accused with tax rolls and court petitions from the decade before. You see wealthier freeholders, families with voice, land, and grudges overrepresented. Rebecca Nurse leased a tract at the heart of a long, bitter boundary dispute touching Reverend James Allen's interests, the Endicott's and the Putnams. Elizabeth Howe's land sat in that same trouble zone, her husband long in quarrel with Putnam allies. George Jacobs S.R. owned good acreage near Preferred Path. Further downriver, Philip and Mary English, deep-pocketed merchants with extensive holdings and political clout, were named the moment the panic drifted toward town. Officials ultimately seized property and accounts tied to the Englishes, with claims totaling about £1,183, an enormous sum that functions as the smoking gun for how accusation translated into liquid asset. Meanwhile, widows with property rights, Martha Corey, Sarah Good with stubborn debts, were easy to isolate and expensive to hold. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the ledger margins. Sheriff George Corwin's office assessed fees on the accused for arrest, travel, irons, and keep. Diet alone could run about 2.5 shillings per week, modest on paper, devastating over months. If families couldn't pay, constables seized movable goods. In cases like Mary Parker's sons, cattle, corn, and hay were taken when the mother's estate couldn't be found, payment flowing from the living to settle the dead woman's bill. Estates of the executed were legally not supposed to be forfeited wholesale in Massachusetts, but practice outpaced principle. Goods vanished, accounts went balanced by force. Jailers collected from the very people the court declared suspect. The crisis had a revenue stream. Impact: who benefited? Start small. Constables and keepers were paid, often from prisoners' assets. Corwin's seizures put goods into circulation among officers and their networks. Town treasuries offset some costs with rates levied on the same neighborhoods pushing the accusations. At the parish level, faction leaders gained negotiating leverage. If your rival's estate was entangled, your claim on a boundary or a right-of-way suddenly faced less pushback. Over months, that translated into favorable settlements, road decisions, and quiet purchases at softer prices. Follow the paper. After the court dissolved, reversals of attainder and apologies slowly arrived, but restitution limped. Some families received partial compensation years later, many did not. By then, inventories had been sold, fields neglected, heirs scattered. The people who'd weathered the storm with their status intact, magistrates, friends, parish officers, creditors with patience, held a stronger hand. Patterns in deeds show transfers clustering near accusers, networks in the years after. Not a flood, but a steady seep. What nobody wanted to say out loud was that the afflicted's pointing fingers acted like a surveyor's rod. A name moved from a contested pasture into a cell, and the field's future shifted. When a jury stalled, a fit accelerated it. When a petition defended a matriarch, a counter-affidavit undermined her. Confessions extracted under duress named people already awkward in local politics, compounding the pressure. Even when acquittals came, months in custody generated debts that forced sale. Clean title likes a desperate seller. You'll recognize this rhythm. If you want to see the divide, compare two lists: who signed petitions for accused neighbors and who furnished complaints. Petitions often came from households with weaker access to the court's inner circle. Complaints clustered around men seated at the parish and county tables. That's how a community's hierarchy turned visions into verdicts. And when the tribunal finally halted, the money moves didn't unwind. Sheriff's bills stood. Guarding fees stood. Some seized goods never returned. There's a telling micro-moment. After an execution day, families begged for bodies while officers presented itemized charges. Pay first, then grieve. Those coins didn't vanish. They trickled into the same small circle administering the panic. And because the province's broader finances were shaky, frontier war, the 1684 charter void and the 1692 charter new, tax rage. The witch machinery doubled as a cash machine, smoothing budgets no one wanted to defend in print. So yes, belief primed the pump. People feared Satan, but the pump delivered to familiar buckets. The map of accusations hugs contested land and high-value corridors. The ledger of payments favors the men who carried writs and chaired meetings. And the silence after, the partial restitutions, the delayed reversals, the lessons learned, obscured a practical outcome. Assets shifted under cover of piety. 3 stories make the pattern sharper. A matriarch on a border, a farmer who refused to plead, a minister tangled in debt. Watch them and the scheme stops looking like chaos. It looks like intent. Case Study 1. Rebecca Nurse's lines in the woods. Stakes first. Rebecca Nurse was the neighbor everyone trusted, elderly, devout, a mother and grandmother whose door stayed open. But her life sat on a line that wouldn't hold still. The farm she and Francis leased, good land with timber and pasture, touched the Putnams' ambitions and the Endicott's claims, all tied to Reverend James Allen's ownership. If that line moved, a family's winter moved with it. That's why this mattered. The case wasn't only about a woman's soul, it was about who got to mark the trees. Action. Years before anyone screamed witch, the dispute was already stacked in the courts. Topsfield said one thing, Salem village another. In the 1680s, the town clan and allies documented Putnam men cutting timber where Topsfield's surveys said Salem had no right. Depositions flew, names hardened into sides. When 1692 cracked open, and Putnam Jr. and her circle said they saw Rebecca's specter. The arrest felt absurd to neighbors. 39 risked their own safety to sign her defense. But the courtroom wasn't a town meeting. During examination, the afflicted convulsed. The magistrates leaned on specters. The narrative shifted from boundary stakes to invisible harm. Here's the pivot that shows intent. At trial, a jury first returned not guilty. It should have ended there, but the afflicted protested in open court. The bench pressed the jury to reconsider after parsing a stray phrase Rebecca had murmured, confused, partially deaf, unsure what she was answering to. They reversed. Acquittal evaporated. That's not justice. That's a decision bending toward a network that had already lost patience with her family's land position. Meanwhile, something else was happening back at the fence line. The nurse tract was leased from Allen, but its neighbors, Endicott's on one side, Putnam ties on another, stood to gain if the nurse heirs lost leverage. Execution doesn't transfer title cleanly in Massachusetts law then, but it freezes people. While Rebecca sat in jail, fees accumulated. Sheriff George Corwin's men assessed for irons, bread, transport. The family scrambled to cover costs while still planting, still arguing boundaries. A widow's plea carries less weight when constables are tallying charges at the door. Micro-story, the day the verdict flipped, Francis Nurse wasn't just losing a spouse, he was losing bargaining power. Neighbors who'd once hedged now measured whether their signatures would be remembered by men who controlled rates and writs. After the hanging, securing Rebecca's body required more supplication and money. Grief became transactional. That's how fear becomes leverage in a countryside where winter always wins the tie. Impact. In the aftermath, the nurse heirs navigated a landscape their mother had held together through reputation more than law. Petitioners had risked much to defend her, but court costs didn't disappear because a good woman died. Over the next years, as reversals of attainder arrived and apologies trickled out, restitution came halting, partial. Land around the disputed edges didn't suddenly reset. Agreements tilted. Quiet sales happened at prices softened by years of stress. The Putnam-aligned parish faction, now shown to be dangerous to cross, gained room to maneuver on roads, timber, and minister rates. What nobody wanted to write in the margins is how the timber stories mattered. Trees marked lines, wood paid debts. Catching Putnam men felling on your side wasn't just a gotcha, it was money walking. When Rebecca's name became a charge, the fight left the woods and entered a courtroom willing to hear spirits. That jump from stump to specter is the Salem trick. Turn a survey into a sin, a boundary into a moral test, then let a special court convert panic into process. There's a late echo worth hearing. Years later, when printed apologies named the wrongs, they praised Rebecca's piety. They didn't redraw the map. They didn't erase the months of fees or the bargaining away of positions under duress. A sainted memory doesn't mend a boundary won by exhaustion. Families learned that lesson the hard way. Righteousness warms no oven when the cow was seized to pay the jailer. So Rebecca Nurse's story isn't a detour into sentiment. It's the template. Put pressure on a matriarch anchoring a contested zone. Use networks to flip an acquittal into a rope. Let fees and fear erode a family's stance. Then watch the lines in the wood's edge where they were always meant by someone to go. Case Study 2. Giles Corey and the Price of Silence. Stakes first. Giles Corey was a stubborn old farmer with a big estate and a bigger reputation for not being told what to do. By 1692, he'd already seen how accusation turned into inventory lists and how a sheriff's fees could empty a barn. He also knew one thing most neighbors didn't pause to consider. Once the court called you a felon, everything you owned could be treated like someone else's problem. So when irons closed on his wrists and his wife Martha was already tangled in the same net, Giles faced a choice that wasn't about theology. It was about what his land would look like after he was gone. Action. Giles refused to plead. He stood mute in the face of a tribunal that could make spectral whispers into a rope. The court answered with a punishment so old it felt medieval, pressing peine forte et dure, designed to force a plea. They took him to the field near the jail, laid him down, and started piling weight. Boards, stones, more stones. Sheriff George Corwin oversaw the scene. Each time they asked for a plea, Giles answered with the same two words, more weight. It wasn't bravado, it was strategy. plead guilty or not guilty, and Stoughton's court had a path to conviction. A conviction opened doors to seize, settle, or simply hold what Giles had spent a lifetime building. Silence jammed the gears. Meanwhile, something else had already been set in motion. Weeks before, Giles had moved to protect his heirs, drafting a will to root the farm to sons-in-law. He understood paper, if not the court's appetite for specters. The pressing wasn't just torture, it was a negotiation, his ribs and breath traded for a chance that his land wouldn't slide into a sheriff's ledger. Around him, neighbors watched a government that couldn't write a stable legal code for witchcraft improvise a death that Massachusetts law didn't authorize. That tells you how urgent the machine had become. They'd rather crush an old man than confront the rules they'd bent. Micro-story? Think of Martha Corey, also accused, sitting in jail while her husband made himself a wall. If he pled and lost, she'd be a widow with a farm ripped apart by claims and costs. If he held silent, he could hand something solid to the next generation. In a year when Sheriff Corwin's men seized cattle and hay from the children of the executed to pay jail bills, that difference mattered. Giles wasn't saving his own life. He was trying to save theirs from the slow blade of fees and opportunism. Impact, the pressing lasted days. Giles died under the stones, the only person in American history executed by judicial pressing. His refusal left the court without a verdict to hang a forfeiture on. It also left a mark on the village, a crack in the spectacle. People who'd cheered examinations fell quiet when they saw boards and boulders used in place of law. Phipps would soon shut down Stoughton's tribunal and disallow spectral evidence. You can argue Giles's death pushed that door open a little faster, but the economic logic didn't end at the field. Corwin still tried to collect. The network that benefited from arrests and imprisonments kept presenting bills. Pressing didn't stop officers from assessing costs for irons, guards, and transport already incurred. It did undermine the simplest path to stripping an estate. That's why Giles's silence became more than defiance. It was a tactic against a balance sheet masquerading as a moral crusade. Here, that's where the price of silence shows up on paper. After the trials, when reversals of attainder trickled out and apologies were printed, the Corey land didn't become a public fund for officials to square accounts. His heirs, battered but not dispossessed, navigated a recovery that others couldn't. Compare that to families like the Parkers, whose sons saw their own goods seized when officials couldn't find an executed mother's estate. Giles had anticipated the squeeze and built around it, even as the court invented a punishment to break him. And yet, the moral of his story is that cunning beats corruption. It's that the court's power targeted property as much as people. Giles met that power with the one lever he still held, his plea, and used it to jam a confiscation pipeline that had already drained too many barns. His last words weren't poetry, they were policy. More weight meant no verdict, no clean legal pretext to turn a farm into a sheriff's marketplace. In Salem, where belief and grievance blurred, silence became both shield and indictment. The stones crushed a man, and they exposed a system that had been pressing families all along. Case Study 3. George Burroughs' debt and a hangman's prayer. Stakes first. George Burroughs wasn't a village crank or an unknown midwife. He'd been Salem village's minister before Samuel Parris, with a pulpit voice and a ledger problem. When he left the parish years earlier, he carried unpaid salary owed to him and a small, humiliating debt to a Putnam for his first wife's funeral. That balance sheet outlived the sermons. By 1692, he was a minister on the Maine frontier, scraping by while war burned along the coast. To Salem's faction, he was a debtor who dared to walk away still owed and still owing. Action, the story coils back to 1683. Burroughs returns to settle accounts and is arrested on that funeral debt by a Putnam. The congregation is divided. Some raise his bond to get him out, others keep tally. He leaves Massachusetts for the harsh edge of Falmouth, where Wabanaki raids and French war make every harvest a gamble. That should have been the end of it. Instead, when the afflictions surge in Parris's house, the Putnam network names Burroughs from miles away. On April 30, 1692, complaints list him with others. Constables travel north, seize a minister from a war zone, and haul him back as if he were the epicenter of Salem's pain. Meanwhile, Salem's Court of Oyer and Terminer has already decided that stories can weigh more than facts. Witnesses tell of Burroughs' supposed feats of uncanny strength, lifting a musket by a finger, carrying barrels as if bewitched. He answers with common sense, levers, balance, practice. It doesn't matter. The afflicted convulse on cue. Their visions carry the day. Burroughs sits in irons in a jail that charges by the week. Those charges will land on someone's table. Here, where the debt thread tightens. Burroughs owed Salem's elite small sums and large resentments. Salem owed him back salary and an ugly exit. The men pushing the trials, embedded in parish and province, knew how to convert moral suspicion into legal action. Every day he's held, the jailer's bill grows. Every step toward the gallows smooths the accounting. A messy creditor-debtor tangle becomes a closure, resolved by rope. This was the moment everything changed. August 19, 1692, Burroughs stands on the ladder at Gallows Hill with 4 others. He asks to speak and recites the Lord's Prayer perfectly. In Puritan lore, a witch can't do that. The crowd wavers. For a heartbeat, the air clears. Then the machine closes ranks. Cotton Mather on horseback reassures them. Satan can mimic piety, don't be deceived. The bodies drop. A prayer that should have broken the spell becomes just another note in a ledger of silenced objection. Impact: on paper, execute a debtor and the accounts don't vanish. Creditors still line up. Jailers still present invoices. Estates freeze. But removing Burroughs solves a problem for the men who clashed with him years before. There's no awkward reinstatement of salary, no public admission that the village had wronged a minister and perhaps owed him. There's certainly no need to negotiate with a man who might call his own witnesses about the parsonage's broken promises. His absence tidies the file. Meanwhile, on the frontier he's ripped from, congregants lose a pastor they can't easily replace. War doesn't pause because Salem needs a scapegoat. The ripple reaches back to Essex County, too. The spectacle of hanging a minister, one who prays on the ladder, pushes doubt into places sermons can't seal. If the court can ignore that moment, what else is it ignoring? Governor Phipps will soon reign in spectral evidence and dissolve Stoughton's tribunal. Burroughs' death doesn't cause the collapse, but it tests the rope holding the panic together. Follow the money after. Restitution will be late and thin. Families of the executed file petitions for relief from fees for return of seized goods. Some get partial sums years later, many don't. The sheriff's office has already converted livestock and hay into cash for charges. The longer the trials ran, the more entrenched those flows became. Burroughs' creditors and the officials who billed him don't write apologies on their receipts. There's one more thread that shows intent. Why go to Maine to drag back an old minister if the aim is just to calm a village? Because some disputes don't end until a signature does, and nothing finishes a signature like a death certificate. A man who once embarrassed a powerful family over a debt, who symbolized the village's chronic failure to pay its clergy, becomes the perfect emblem to punish. The theology covers the act covers the debt. In the end, Burroughs' prayer hangs over the records like a watermark. People heard it. They felt the wrongness of ignoring it. But the court didn't run on conscience. It ran on a rhythm of accusation and cost. Debt opened the door, grievance gave the push, and a tribunal eager for certainty locked it. A minister's last words met a balance sheet, and the balance sheet won for a while. The economics of hysteria. Stakes first. When fear becomes policy, somebody sends a bill. In 1692, accusation wasn't just a path to the gallows, it was a revenue stream. Every warrant meant fees. Every mile from village to jail meant fees. Every day in irons, every loaf of jail bread, every guard's hour, fees. If you couldn't pay, officers took what stood in the yard. Cattle first, then corn and hay, then tools. Families fought for bodies while sheriffs held itemized charges. The math was simple. Panic paid. Action start at the door. A constable arrives with a warrant. He gets paid for serving it and for the time spent taking you in. The cart hire to Salem jail, that's added to your account. The irons on your wrists. Irons cost money. You pay for the privilege of restraint. Food in the dungeon isn't free. Keepers charge diet by the week, and if your kin bring bread, there's a fee for that too. If you confess, you live and keep paying. If you refuse and die, the bill doesn't die with you. Meanwhile, the sheriff's office turns paper into property. George Corwin's men seize movables when families fall behind. A team of oxen, a stack of hay, the winter's corn standing in the crib. Records show sons complaining that when their mother's estate proved empty, officers took theirs instead. Cattle, corn, hay, to settle her charges. That's not rumor. That's how the office balanced its books. In a colony with shaky tax compliance and wartime expenses, these user fees for justice filled the cracks the legislature couldn't. What nobody knew at the time or admitted was how the jail economy created incentives. Keepers were paid from prisoners' assets. Guards had reason to keep cells full and calendars long. Confessions that named more witches didn't just extend the moral crusade, they extended payroll. Each new name meant new warrants, new transports, new diet tallies. Even acquittals didn't erase the ledger. walk free, and you still owed for irons and bread. There was a second cash loop, estates in limbo. Massachusetts didn't formally forfeit all property on conviction the way Old English statutes threatened, but officials behaved as if time and confusion were permission. Hold an estate for charges, delay returns, auction goods to prevent spoil. The longer the trial calendar stretched, the more opportunities to monetize uncertainty. Families begged for receipts and were told to be patient. Meanwhile, cows changed barn. Now layer the church and court financing on top. The village had been scraping to pay ministers, wood, and repairs for years. The province was paying for soldiers on the main frontier and trying to rebuild authority under a new charter. Cash was scarce. Witchcraft business, warrants, examinations, transports, created work the government could bill directly to the accused. It looked like order. It acted like a tax farm. A general rate hike provoked protest. A jailer's bill slipped through the fear. Micro story: a widow sells her spinning wheel to cover her husband's jail diet while she petitions the court to release him. While she waits, the sheriff's man takes 2 heifers for transport costs already due. Her neighbor, who sat on the parish committee, buys the heifers cheap at an officer-arranged sale. He doesn't connect the bargain to the petition he'd refused to sign last month. He doesn't need to. The system connects it for him. Meanwhile, in Boston, Governor Phipps tries to steady a province with a borrowed legal skeleton. He creates the special court because jails are jammed and the docket is stalled. Speed on paper saves money. In practice, speed multiplies charges. Each sitting of oyer and terminer generates a stack of fees that flow outward: clerks, marshals, constables, keepers. When the court dissolves, those men don't volunteer refunds. They present total. There's one detail that shows the logic plainly. Prisoners had to pay to be released after acquittal. If your neighbors finally convinced a jury, you still couldn't walk until your account was cleared. That turned innocence into a negotiable commodity. Sell a meadow edge, pawn tools, beg relatives. At roughly 2.5 shillings a week, a season in jail could equal a laborer's wages for months. And if you couldn't pay, you stayed. Some died there not from sentence, but from the debt of being suspected. Impact: the economics shaped outcomes beyond the hangings. Prolonged custody forced fire sales. Heirs traded acreage for time. A farmer who might have fought a boundary case for years folded after a season in jail fees, selling a strip that gave his neighbor road access. Those small changes remapped influence. Parish factions aligned with the accusing network emerged with fewer rivals and more leverage to set rates, choose ministers, and steer road work. In the aftermath, when the legislature reversed attainders and apologized, compensation barely touched what the panic had extracted. A few families received partial payments. Most saw nothing like restitution. Decades later, the city would make millions on witch tourism, while descendants tallied 18th century awards that wouldn't buy a team of oxen. Revenues and reparations never matched. So yes, theology mattered. People feared Satan. But fear alone doesn't explain why a sheriff's ledger sits in the center of this story, or why a jailer's diet bill could outlast a verdict. The trials ran on belief. They ran because belief paid. You'll recognize this rhythm, monetize the accusation, and the system prefers more accusations. Once a government learns that panic can be itemized, restraint becomes a luxury it can't afford. Power vacuum. Lost charter found opportunity. While the jailers were counting coins, the colony's spine was bending. The old Massachusetts charter had been yanked in 1684. The Dominion of New England experiment collapsed with the Glorious Revolution, and for years, authority ran on habit, not law. Then in 1692, a new charter arrived with Governor William Phipps and a blank space where a criminal code and court structure should have been. In that gap, choices made by a few men would shape who lost homes and who kept power. You'll recognize this rhythm. Revoke the rule book, announce an emergency, then improvise standards that are easy to weaponize. Stakes first. A government without settled rules can make expediency look like justice. With frontier war draining the treasury and tax revolt simmering, leaders needed fast order. Fast order needs tools, and tools need targets. Witchcraft, with its ready-made moral language and pliable proof, offered both. If you can prosecute shadows, you can perform authority without solving the budget. Action. Phipps landed in May with pressing priorities: fight the French and Wabanaki up north, pacify a restless province, and stand up a government that didn't yet exist on paper. The General Court hadn't reconvened to pass a full suite of laws. The jails were already swollen with suspects examined under ad hoc magistrates through the winter. So Phipps made a move. On May 27, he created a special court of oyer and terminer, installed William Stoughton as chief judge and told it to act according to English law and the customs of the new province. That sounded orderly. In practice, after the 1684 revocation and before the 1692 order hardened, it meant Stoughton could pick the evidentiary threshold. He chose speed, and he allowed Spectre. Meanwhile, political debts nudged the levers. Phipps owed his post to London patrons and Boston elites eager to stabilize trade. Stoughton, tied to the colony's upper tier and steeled by providential certainty, prized decisiveness. Accepting spectral evidence fit the moment. It required no search warrants, no surveys, no tangled property records, just synchronized testimony from the afflicted and a court willing to hear the invisible. Within days, the machine we saw earlier, warrants, examinations, indictments, got an official stamp. What nobody knew at the time or admitted was how this emergency architecture solved more than a docket problem. It shifted attention from failures that hurt, botched campaigns on the main frontier, tax collection fiascos, and a new charter that clipped the colony's old autonomy after 1684's revocation. Hang a witch, and you didn't have to explain why soldiers were unpaid. Process a confession, and you didn't have to defend a levy. Public fear became the scaffolding for a new regime to demonstrate control. While that was happening in Boston, parish factions in villages like Salem used the state's performative strength to settle their own scores. The Putnam network's complaints arrived at a tribunal primed to validate them. Stoughton's bench, stacked with magistrates who socialized with the men carrying writs, made the village's grievances sound like the province's necessity. It's not a conspiracy in the cloak and dagger sense, it's alignment. Local ambition met provincial need, and the rope tied the knot. There was one problem looming. Spectral evidence even then sat on shaky theology. Increased Mather urged caution, ministers hedged their counsel, jurists outside the panic called the standard unmoored. But the charter's awkward birth gave Stoughton room. With the legislature late to codify boundaries, the tribunal could improvise under the banner of emergency. Improvised law breeds unintended beneficiaries. Sheriffs billed freely. Keepers ran tabs. Clerks accumulated fees. And every public hanging promised to quiet unrest the government couldn't otherwise quell. Microstory. In August, as the tribunal hit its stride, news from the frontier was bleak. Raids, losses, petitions for defense money. The same week Reverend George Burroughs prayed on the ladder and swung, Phipps faced a province asking where the muskets and meal were. A spectacle in Salem was not a policy for Maine, but it filled the vacuum of action with a show of will. For a month, it worked, and it paid fees. Impact, power is addictive when it finally feels like control. Stoughton pushed on after doubt crept in, scolding juries, leaning on confessions, reading convulsions like depositions. But the vacuum he'd filled began to pull back. When spectral evidence reached too close, touching merchants like Philip English and even hinting toward the governor's circle, the calculation changed. Phipps, sensing danger to the fragile charter order and to his own standing, stepped in. In October, he forbade spectral evidence, dissolved Oyer and Terminer, and shifted remaining cases to a new court that proceeded more cautiously. Public policy pivoted not because justice finally weighed more, but because the emergency tool started cutting its makers. What nobody writes on proclamations is the ledger under the pivot. By the time Phipps halted Stoughton, the emergency had already monetized fear. Bills stood, seizures stood, estates remained entangled. The province had shown it could raise a scaffold faster than it could raise a regiment, and it had discovered that panic could carry revenue that taxes could not. So the power vacuum didn't just let witchcraft in. It invited opportunists to organize it, gave officials a stage to prove authority, and taught the government a bad habit. When law is thin, spectacle can thicken it. The cost landed on fields and families the charter was supposed to protect. Cracks in the spell. Doubt, petitions, and a governor's exit. While the scaffold kept its schedule, doubt slid under the door. It started in the margins, ministers writing cautiously, neighbors whispering that a perfect Lord's Prayer shouldn't end in a rope. Increase Mather put it on paper. Better that 10 supposed witches escape than one innocent hang. He wasn't alone. Clergy across the colony hedged their sermons, warning that specters were slippery witnesses. They didn't slam the gate, but they rattled it loud enough for Phipps to hear. Stakes first. Once skepticism reached the pulpit, it reached jurors' kitchens. A husband who'd watched girls convulse began asking what counted as proof when anyone's shape could be borrowed by the devil. Mothers waiting at the jail with bread asked why innocents carried a bill. If the standard was visions, nobody was safe. If payment followed suspicion, nobody was solvent. Doubt wasn't abstract, it was a calculation about life and debt. Action, petitions gathered. 39 had dared sign for Rebecca Nurse. More followed for the Bradburys, for the Proctors, for neighbors who'd never missed a Sabbath. Towns presented suit to the General Court and Council, demanding restraint, reversal, relief. In March 1702, a sweeping plea for restitution put it bluntly: restore reputations, stop spectral nonsense, reckon with what you've done. Even before that, judges heard it in smaller bursts. Depositions shading against the afflicted's claims, witnesses retracting, jurors balking at the flimsy. Meanwhile, Governor Phipps felt the ground tilt. Accusers brushed too close to his circle. Whispers named his own wife. Merchants like Philip English, with ships and influence, were in irons. War on the frontier went badly. Taxpayers fumed. The new charter's legitimacy hung by a thread. Phipps had built an emergency court to show control. Now that same court threatened to show he'd lost it. He ordered a pause. Spectral evidence no longer admissible, Oyer and Terminer dissolved. Cases shifted to a new court that moved slower, demanded firmer proof, and faced with the same afflicted drama, started to acquit. What nobody wanted to admit was how much the Burroughs moment had done. A minister's perfect prayer at the gallows had lodged like grit under the machine's gears. If a witch could pray like a saint, either the theology was wrong or the trials were. Cotton Mather's instant rebuttal soothed one crowd for one day, but the image lingered. The next jury to hear a case felt it in their bones. Care and caution turned from advice into policy. Micro story. In Salem village, a man who'd once cheered examinations watched his cousin return from jail with an invoice. He signed a petition he'd avoided before. The sheriff's man, who'd made a tidy sum on transports, muttered about changes in Boston. The afflicted still convulsed, but the magistrate asked for witnesses who'd seen more than a shadow. The room's temperature changed. Impact, Phipps's order didn't reset accounts. Sheriff Corwin's charges stood. Keepers demanded arrears. Seized goods rarely walked home, but the pipe narrowed. Without spectral testimony, confessions dried up. With confessions drying up, the supply of new names shrank. Fear no longer minted money on demand. By spring 1693, pardons and releases rolled out. Some who'd pled guilty recanted. Some who'd held out walked free and poor. Clergy leaned into contrition. The return of several ministers lived larger in retrospect than in June, but its caution now looked like a rope thrown backward. Sermons of fasting and remorse followed. Judges edged toward apology. Stoughton, stubborn, refused to sign reprieves. Phipps, calculating, blamed Stoughton in letters to London, distancing his governorship from the blood. Politics moved as conscience where conscience had lagged. The petitions kept coming, morphing from pleas for lives into pleas for names cleared and property restored. The legislature slowly forbade spectral evidence, then reversed some attainders. Years later, more reversals, more printed sorrow. But the paper trail of regret didn't balance the ledgers. Families still held debts for jail bread. Estates managed during the panic weren't unsold. Doubt had closed the court's door. It couldn't pry open every barn it had helped empty. Here's the cold truth. The spell broke because belief faltered and because power felt threatened. Doubt plus politics made a policy. And once the show stopped, the cost remained on the same tables. Widows counting coins, children placed out, sheriffs satisfied. Aftermath. Apologies without restitution. When the hangings stopped, the bills didn't. What came next wore the language of confession. Fast days, proclamations, printed regrets. But when families asked for their cows, their corn, their hay, the answers stalled. Ministers preached remorse. Sheriffs showed receipts. That gap, sorry in church, stubborn at the door, defined the aftermath. Stakes first. If your mother swung or your father rotted in a cell, you needed two things: her name cleared and your tools back. Without a cleared name, contracts soured. Without tools, next season failed. The legislature could pass a day of prayer. It couldn't plow your field. Action. In 1697, the colony called a public fast to mourn the late tragedy. Some judges stood and admitted they'd been carried by zeal. Samuel Parris, under pressure, crafted a half-apology, sorrow for errors without owning the engine he'd stoked. Families met sorrow with petitions. They asked for formal reversals of attainder so estates could breathe, and for money to cover jail diet, irons, transports, and seized goods. Meanwhile, the paperwork moved like winter. In 1703 and 1704, efforts edged forward. By 1711, a bill finally reversed judgments for a slate of names and allocated compensation. On paper, it sounded like justice catching up. In practice, the sums were partial, uneven, delayed. Some families received a fraction of what jailers had charged, others fought just to get on the list. Years had ground down claims, heirs were scattered. Fields had been sold to cover bread, while the court still breathed. What nobody wanted to enshrine in statute was how officials kept their own hands clean. The bill that restored reputations also sheltered the city from lawsuits. Descendants wouldn't be able to sue Salem for damages stemming from 1692. You can apologize with one hand and close the courthouse door with the other. Salem learned that trick early. Micro story, Mary Parker's sons complained in 1692 that when officers couldn't find their mother's estate, they took the sons' cattle, corn, and hay. Years later, restitution lists dribbled money towards some victims' kin. But those heifers, gone. The hay, eaten, paid out, forgotten in an officer's tally. A printed apology doesn't put milk in a pail. Another beat. The Englishes fled jail and eventually returned to reclaim some property, but that was a merchant family with reach. Many widows came back to empty barns and a ledger that said they still owed for irons. The sheriff's office treated innocence as a postscript. Fees accrued during suspicion didn't vanish when a governor halted spectral evidence. Innocent or guilty, the account stood. Impact, the structure that had monetized the panic, didn't refund what it had collected. Jailers' diet bills became family debts that outlived the crisis. Seized movables had already been folded into officers' pay. Estate freezes disrupted planting cycles and marriages. A daughter placed out as a servant to cover a mother's board didn't come home when a judge signed a reversal. The social fabric tore where it was thinnest. Poor households, widows, borderland farms. Meanwhile, the town learned to market the horror. Over centuries, Salem's revenues from the witch story would dwarf those token 1711 payments. Tourists arrived for ghosts, the city counted receipts. Compare numbers and the irony bites. In a modern October, tens of millions in revenue. In the early 18th century, a total restitution pot that wouldn't buy a block's worth of today's storefront rent. Revenues and reparations never met. There was one more layer of quiet harm. Reputations don't reset with a proclamation. Families carried the shadow of accusation into marriages, parish votes, disputes that had nothing to do with witchcraft. Being cleared on paper didn't erase the memory of who refused to sign your petition or who bought your oxen cheap. The parish map of alliances hardened along those lines. The faction that had accused sat on committees. The petitioners learned to keep their heads down. Clergy held their own reckoning in slow motion. Some printed mea culpas, others balanced regret with self-defense, as if bad evidence were a storm and they too had been rained on. It's easier to confess a mistake than to name who profited from it. Sermons reached for sin and providence, few reached for account books. The result was a moral narrative that soothed the pulpit and spared the ledger. Micro story, a grandson reads a reversal of attainder in 1711, clearing his grandmother's name. He folds the paper and walks back past a pasture now fenced by the neighbor who signed a complaint. The stone in the field doesn't move because the statute did. That's what partial looks like. So the aftermath wasn't a clean turn from darkness to light. It was a long negotiation where apologies cost little and restitution cost cash. The colony chose the cheaper path. Families patched what they could, sold what they had to, and taught their children the real lesson. When panic pays, justice arrives late and light. The paper trail. Deeds, wills, suits. If you want to see intention without hearing anyone admit it, you read what people signed. Deeds talk, wills whisper. Court minutes keep score. Start with a simple overlay. Families most entangled in accusations show up again shortly after in transactions that nudge boundaries, resolve long-standing controversies, or convert livestock into cash under color of fees. Not a tidal wave, more like a steady drip that fills the same bucket. Stakes first, paper decides who eats. A deed recorded in Salem, Ipswich, or Boston could turn a disputed swale into a sure thing. A will drafted being under great troubles and affliction reroutes land before the sheriff can sniff it. A suit for fees, diet, irons, cart hire becomes a lien in practice, if not by statute. The records don't call anyone a thief. They don't have to. They show how fear altered bargaining positions and altered positions changed signatures. Action, look at clusters. After 1692, property transfers appear around Salem Village's northern belt, Topsfield edges where Town, Nurse, Estey, Howe, and Wilds once fought the Putnams and their allies. Some are clean sales between kin. Some resolve variations in line, with a fence now set where a matriarch once held her ground. You see heirs of the accused, short on cash from months of jail diet, consenting to narrow strips ceded for good and valuable consideration. Consideration often looks like time. Time to settle a jailer's account, time to keep a remaining acre planted. Now read wills. Giles Corey's pre-pressing conveyances to sons-in-law weren't unique. Anxious testators across Essex tightened family circles when arrests spread. Drafting in the day of distress shows up as a phrase. The intent was protection. The effect was also to quiet potential claims from creditors watching the witch machinery work. Meanwhile, officers like Sheriff George Corwin worked a different pipeline. When estates couldn't be found, they reached into children's barns. Mary Parker's sons' complaint, cattle, corn, hay seized for their mother's charges, doesn't end in a refund noted in any restitution schedule. The seizure becomes a transaction by silence. Court minutes fill gaps. Read examinations, tales, and you find costs assessed to the prisoner's account. Read March 1702 petitions, and you hear the accused's kin itemize journeys to Salem and Boston, weeks of diet irons imposed, and tools sold to cover it. Later, the 1711 reversal bill lists names cleared and awards money that, when converted to today's dollars, looks small even before you subtract what sheriffs and keepers already collected. The math never balances. Meanwhile, tax rolls and selectmen's records show accusers' network steadying. Parish committees populated by the same surnames that furnished complaints approve road work that benefits their lanes or apportion ministers' wood from tracts newly agreed. Not scandalous in isolation, telling in sequence. When your rival's deed is clouded by months in jail and you've avoided entanglement, you attend meetings with a freer hand. Here's a micro-story pinned to paper. A Topsfield man signs a quitclaim to avoid further trouble, fixing a boundary that earlier depositions contested. He'd signed a petition for Rebecca Nurse. He'd also pawned tools to pay a kinswoman's jail diet. The quitclaim isn't labeled restitution. It's fatigue monetized. The opposite micro-story sits in a sheriff's daybook. Charges for irons and transport posted against a widow acquitted but held until all dues satisfied. To leave, she borrows against a meadow edge. Weeks later, a neighbor on the examining magistrate's cousin list records a small purchase adjoining said meadow. What nobody knew at the time, or pretended not to, was that the witch year created a class of motivated sellers. Clean title loves motivation. Fear accelerates probate. Orphans' guardians accept offers they would have refused a season earlier. Court guardianships list minors placed out to learn trades in households that never signed their mother's petitions. The placements are legal. The timing says the quiet part. Deeds and suits also expose exceptions that prove the rule. Philip and Mary English, with Reach and Friends, recover much of what panic tried to swallow. Their case clogs the tribunal's gears enough to help Phipps close the court. But for dozens of families without ships, recovery meant partial returns and long memories. The restitution lists exclude names at first, then add some later, then stop. There's no schedule where a sheriff returns hay. Now widen the lens. In the 195s, as Salem formalizes memorial gestures, legislators write protections against suits by descendants. That's paper too, forward-looking this time. The city will grow a tourism economy on the ghost story. Its balance sheets won't fear old bills. Revenues and reparations part ways permanently. Impact, the archive doesn't deliver a confession. It delivers patterns, transfers cluster near accusers' networks. Boundary agreements favor the persistent party after the other side endures months of fees. Wills anticipate seizure and try to duck it. Court minutes convert breath into bills. And when the legislature prints regret, it also prints limits. So when someone says Salem was chaos, pull the volumes. Chaos doesn't leave tidy clerks' hands on so many steps. The paper trail doesn't shout, it accumulates. And by the last page, it reads like what it is. A map of fear laid neatly over a map of property. The myth, that protects the money. The ghost story is tidy. It says a town lost its mind, learned a lesson, and moved on. That myth does a job. It keeps the ledgers out of sight. Call it hysteria, and you don't have to ask who served the warrants, who wrote the bills, who walked off with the heifers. Chaos comforts the beneficiaries because chaos forgives. Stakes first. If the public believes Salem was a moral panic with no center, there's no point following the receipts. Without intent, there's no accountability. Families who lost tools to a sheriff's diet charge become footnotes instead of creditors. Boundary agreements, inked after months of jail time, look like neighborly compromises, not settlements under duress. A myth of madness protects the men who converted fear into income and leverage. Action, watch how the story gets curated. Textbooks lean on the afflicted girls, the spectral theatrics, the poppets and touch tests. They mention reversals and apologies as epilogue. They rarely linger on the sheriff's office converting livestock into pay or the 1711 compensation list that paid late and light. Museum placards highlight a minister on horseback calming a crowd, not the officer tallying transport fees by the gallows. Tourism poses you beside a broomstick. It doesn't walk you through a probate docket where a widow sells a meadow edge to get her husband out of irons. Meanwhile, the language of mass hysteria pulls focus from patterns we've just mapped. Clusters of accusation hugging valuable corridors and contested lines, accuser networks seated at parish tables, post-trial transfers pooling near the same surnames. Hysteria flattens plot. It says everybody was swept away, so nobody steered. But court minutes and tax rolls don't sweep. They record. They show a sheriff charging acquitted prisoners for release. They show sons paying for their mother's jail bread after her body is cut down. Those facts don't fit under a fog machine. What nobody wants to emphasize is the convenience. A panic narrative spares the province's leadership from owning an emergency court that monetized fear. It spares local elites from explaining why their names repeat across complaints, committees, and land decisions. It spares descendants from asking why their great-grandmother's petitioners ended up selling strips to the families that accused her. If the devil did it, nobody else has to. Micro-story, a guide in October points to Proctor's ledge and tells you about curses. 10 blocks away, an archive book lists diet due beside a widow's name paid by 2 cows seized. One sells tickets, the other implicates systems. Guess which version makes a city budget? There's another layer, absolution through time. As years pass, apologies read like closure. The printed regret becomes the moral punctuation mark. We were wrong, we're sorry, story over. But the statute that reversed attainders also shielded the town from being sued by descendants. That's a choice dressed as contrition. It says the conscience is satisfied, the accounts are not. The myth helps that bargain hold. Here, S where it gets practical. Myth's guide policy. If you teach Salem as a freak storm, you dull your instinct to check who benefits during future storms. You ignore how fees, liens, and emergency courts can tilt markets. You accept that fear creates inevitable mistakes instead of noticing that fear reliably enriches particular offices and networks. The past becomes a haunted house, not a handbook. Meanwhile, families carry lived memory that contradicts the ghost tour. In letters and petitions, they counted coins, not specters. They described a widow selling cloth and a bedstead for jail charges. They named officers who withheld bodies till bills were settled. Their voices don't sound hysterical. They sound exhausted, precise, and broke. The myth turns their accounting into background noise. Impact, the hysteria narrative is profitable now too. It sells t-shirts and tarot decks, hotels, and hayrides. That economy depends on keeping the receipts abstract. Shift the lens to fees and seizures and the mood changes from spooky fun to civic exploitation. Cities prefer the first, so textbooks keep the second in a footnote, if at all. One detail breaks the trance. Revenues versus reparations. Modern October brings in tens of millions for Salem. The early 18th century restitution pot, inflation adjusted, wouldn't cover a sliver of that month. The imbalance isn't an accident, it's a tradition. Prophet loves myth because myth hides the markup. So here's the offer the myth makes. Let us tell it as frenzy, and you won't have to follow the money. Here's the counteroffer the records make. Follow the money, and the frenzy looks organized enough to move assets. If you want to learn from Salem, retire the ghost that comforts and read the ledger that doesn't. What nobody tells you about Salem? Here's the quiet part. It's a property story wearing a monster mask. Strip away the shrieks and poppets, and what's left is leverage, who could turn fear into liens, into fees, into favorable boundaries and quiet purchases. The map of accusations hugged value, the ledgers harvested it. That doesn't erase belief. It explains who learned to bill it. The same tactics repeat. First, fear sets the frame. Make a danger hard to disprove, specters then, contagion, subversion, or moral threat now. Second, lower the evidentiary bar. Emergency courts, temporary standards, exceptions that become habits. Third, monetize custody. Charge for the warrant, the transport, the confinement, the release. Fourth, entangle property. Freeze accounts, hold estates for charges, push sales to avoid further trouble. Finally, narrate it as chaos when the bills come due. If nobody steered, nobody owes. You might be surprised how familiar the playbook looks. Swap a parsonage for a zoning board, a sheriff's diet bill for administrative fees, a spectral claim for a vague compliance violation. The language changes, the mechanism doesn't. People under suspicion pay to be processed. While they pay, they miss planting seasons, payroll windows, filing deadlines. That's when assets move from the weak to the organized. What nobody emphasizes is how quickly interim standards shape permanent outcomes. Salem's special court existed for months. Its choices moved landlines that didn't move back. In any age, provisional rules can settle disputes no jury ever sees. That's the value of a panic. It accelerates the kind of decisions that would otherwise drag through committees and appeals. There's another piece we dodge when we tell the ghost version: who is positioned to benefit before the first accusation? In Salem Village, the Putnam network already sat at the tables where roads, rates, and ministers were decided. The court amplified their reach. In any community, the faction that holds the agenda, selectmen, planning boards, corporate council, turns fear into policy most efficiently. The rest learn to endure it. Micro-story: a neighbor in 1692 refuses to sign a complaint. Later, his wife brings bread to the jail and pays the keeper's fee. The couple sells a strip along the road to cover arrears. Decades on, the road is widened along that strip. No proclamation calls it restitution. The line just stayed where fear pushed it. That's how policy hides in households. Now listen for the echoes in our own time. Emergency orders that suspend hearings, fees that must be paid before appeal, asset freezes pending investigation that outlast the investigation. The rhetoric is safety, security, morality. The result is often transfer, titles cleaned by pressure, opportunities consolidated by delay. Follow the incentives, and you'll find the beneficiaries faster than you'll find the villain. None of this denies that people believed in witches. It says belief alone doesn't draw a corridor on a map. What draws lines is organization over panic. The accusers were organized. The keepers were organized. The sheriffs were organized. Victims were isolated, then charged for the privilege. That imbalance, more than theology, decides outcome. There's one last hidden lesson. Apology without restitution stabilizes the system that profited. Salem proved it. The colony fasted, printed sorrow, and paid a little. It also blocked future suits and kept the myth tidy enough to market. When you see a public contrition that doesn't include a ledger, remember the hay, the cows, the jail bread. Remember who got paid. So when you hear Salem used as a moral parable, ask the question that rarely makes the plaque. Who owned what before, who owned what after, and what rules changed in between? If you can answer that, you won't need specters to explain anything. You'll have a map, a docket, and a habit to watch the next time fear starts writing invoices. Modern echoes: fear as a foreclosure tool. We don't have gallows anymore. We have notices taped to doors. But the rhythm, you'll recognize it. A crisis arrives, disease, terror, crime, a market that needs discipline. Leaders promise order, lower standards to get it fast, and while fear does the talking, fees and liens do the walking. By the time the apology shows up, the keys are already in someone else's pocket. Stakes first. In the modern version, the sheriff's diet bill becomes processing fees and servicing charges. The special court becomes an emergency directive or a memo that lets agencies move first and explain later. The accused aren't witches, they're owners in default, landlords out of compliance, small businesses under review. The language sounds administrative. The outcome is familiar. Assets slide from people with shallow cushions to institutions that can wait you out. Actions start with panic-driven policy. After a shock, say a financial crash, rules bend. Moratoriums protect some, but enforcement tools sharpen for others. A bank can file a notice of default faster than a borrower can get a human on the phone. Late fees compound. Escrow shortages appear when property taxes rise. The servicer advances the difference and adds it to your monthly payment with penalties. Miss one deadline while your hours are cut, and the software flags your file as delinquent. From there, the pipeline moves you. Meanwhile, the evidentiary standard tilts. A computer model can mark your neighborhood high risk, raising insurance requirements that your policy no longer meets. That triggers a force-placed policy at triple the cost, charged to your account. You object, the line cites protocol. You're not in a trial. You're in an algorithmic Euler and Terminer where the hearsay is data and the benchmark is speed. What nobody tells you at the time is how the fee economy makes delay profitable. Every certified letter is a charge. Broker price opinions, drive-by valuations ordered in batches become billable. Inspections to verify occupancy happen monthly even when you answer the door. Each one adds to the tab. The longer you hang on, the more the account grows and the less plausible a cure becomes. This is custody monetized without bars. Micro story: a barber keeps his shop open through a pandemic with a loan he didn't want. Revenue dips, the lender offers forbearance, no payments for 6 months. He signs. In month 7, the total is due as a lump sum. He can't pay. The lender spreads it out at a higher rate than tax on modification fees. By winter, the shop survives, but his house slides into loss mitigation. He lists it, hoping to sell clean, but the lien stack scares buyers. The property goes to auction for less than he owes. The difference doesn't vanish, it follows him. No rope, same logic. There's another route: code enforcement as leverage. A city declares a nuisance after anonymous complaints: grass too high, a fence too low, a window cracked. Daily fines accrue. A hearing is scheduled on short notice. If you miss it, wrong address, wrong shift, the board approves an abatement order. The city hires contractors, bills you, and when you can't pay, files a lien. Later, a land bank or developer acquires the parcel for back taxes and fees. The brochure calls it revitalization. In the file, it reads like diet do. You'll recognize this rhythm. Meanwhile, policing adopts civil tools. Civil asset forfeiture lets agencies seize cash and cars connected to suspected crime without a conviction. The standard is low, the burden is on the owner to get it back, and the clock favors the taker. People sign away property rather than hire lawyers they can't afford. It's the same choice Salem families faced. Sell the tool that feeds you to stop the bleeding, or keep the tool and watch the charges grow. Here's the pivot that makes it systemic. Special rules meant for emergencies linger. Temporary eviction bans expire while rent debts remain. Repayment plans include fees that balloon balances past recovery. Temporary, pandemic court procedures about virtual hearings and accelerated calendars persist, reducing the odds a tenant or borrower can appear, present documents, or negotiate face-to-face. A missed login becomes a default judgment. That's not witchcraft. It's a modern specter, absence on a screen interpreted as guilt. Microstory: an elderly couple on a fixed income misses a property tax payment by a few $100s. The county sells the tax lien to an investor. Fees pile on. Months later, to clear the lien, they must pay multiples of the original debt. They try to refinance. The credit pull lowers their score. The offer vanishes. They lose the house for a fraction of its value. The investor cleans title and flips. In the paper, this is innovative finance that keeps cities solvent. In the kitchen, it's a petition denied. Impact: the ripple looks like Salem scaled. Neighborhoods with the least slack see the most transfers. Titles consolidate in portfolios. The people who set the agenda, councils, boards, lenders, don't think in villains and victims. They think in instruments and compliance. But the pattern is legible. Fear accelerates decisions, lowered standards widen discretion, and every step has a fee attached. If you can't pay, you can't participate in the process that decides whether you get to keep the thing you're paying for. Meanwhile, apologies arrive. Banks sign settlements without admitting wrongdoing, paying fines that become the cost of operating at scale. Cities launch forgiveness programs that waive some penalties, but only after headlines and often with hurdles that filter out the busiest and the most precarious. The gap between revenues and reparations persists. October sales pitch the haunted past. Quarterly reports count the quiet present. There's one more echo worth hearing. When skepticism reaches the bench today, judges questioning robo-signed documents, legislatures capping fees, it slows the machine, like Phipps disallowing spectral evidence in late 1692. But the arrears remain. The seized cars don't roll back. The houses don't reappear on Monday morning. That's why the lesson matters now. If you want different outcomes, you can't wait for the apology. You have to raise the evidentiary bar before the notices print, cap the fees before the lien sells, and build due process that a person working 2 jobs can realistically use. So when the next emergency memo lands and officials say it's temporary, remember Salem's special court, months that moved boundaries that never moved back. Ask who can build the process, who can pause a clock, who must pay to stand still. If the answers line up, you're not looking at chaos. You're looking at a system that knows how to turn fear into a foreclosure tool and how to keep the proceeds. Human cost. Names, not numbers. Start with a kitchen. Mary Osgood's daughter carries a loaf to the jail and counts the coins in her fist twice before she hands them over for diet. On the walk home, she passes their pasture with 1 fewer cow. The keeper doesn't know her name. His ledger has it as paid. A boy named Isaac Esty is sent to live with a cousin 3 towns away to learn a trade. He's 12. His mother, Mary, was hanged in September. The cousin is kind, but Isaac sleeps with his shoes near the bed in case someone comes at night with another paper. Years later, he can't remember the sermon from the fast day. He remembers the cart. Sarah Good's little Dorothy, 4 or 5, depending on which record you trust, sat in irons in the Boston jail. She confessed to anything adults suggested because she wanted to go home. She didn't. When she finally did, she'd learned the names of tools by how they hurt. In Topsfield, the Esty family sells a feather bed and 2 pewter plates to cover weeks of jail bread for the ones still breathing. A neighbor, who had signed against Mary, buys the plates. Sunday dinner tastes like fear for a while. A man named John Proctor Jr. returns to a house emptied of more than furniture. His father, John S.R., is dead from the rope. His mother, Elizabeth, survived. The farm stands, but the neighbors won't lend a team for plowing. He barters a future share of barley for a single afternoon with someone's oxen. The field comes in thin. Dorcas whores kin petition for her life and visit with coins stitched into a hem. When she is reprieved, the coins go to the keeper anyway. To leave a cell, you pay the room you never wanted. The Parker sons, John and Joseph, write their complaint that when officers couldn't find their mother Mary's estate, they took the sons' cattle, corn, and hay. Say those words out loud and listen to how plain they are. There's no theory in them, just loss. A widow named Deliverance Dane signs with a shaking hand because her husband's name, Nathaniel, sits on a list that keeps him from voting and her from borrowing. She trades a strip of meadow to a cousin for a note that says, "All dues satisfied." She keeps the note in a Bible pressed flat like a leaf. George Jacobs S.R., hanged in August, leaves behind a granddaughter who had named him in terror and then begged for mercy. Margaret Jacobs lives with the bruise of that sentence for decades. When she marries, her husband's family pretends not to have read the petition where she asked the court to spare the life she had helped end. An 8-year-old named Abigail sees her mother, Rebecca Nurse, led out on July 19. She hears the creak of the cart before she sees it. In old age, she can't stand that sound in the yard, wheels on wood, without her hands shaking. Trauma becomes heirloom. A keeper in Salem takes a child's blanket to settle a week's diet for the mother and tells himself he's doing his duty. He folds the blanket carefully. He never puts that part in any affidavit. A servant named Mercy, who once screamed on cue in the meeting house, grows up and has children of her own. When they ask about 1692, she tells them that the devil is real and also that men with papers are more dangerous than anything in a sermon. She says both things because both feel true. A blacksmith's apprentice, Thomas, spends his savings to hire a cart to bring his aunt home after acquittal. At the jail door, he learns there's a release fee. He pawns his hammer, the tool that would have paid next week's board. He never gets it back. His hand aches in winter where the new hammer doesn't fit right. A Quaker from Salem town refuses to take off his hat in court and gets fined for the hat on top of the fees for refusing to swear. He pays with the sale of his wife's loom. The cloth she would have woven becomes rent to someone else. A minister in another town reads the proclamation for a fast day and then quietly pays a jail bill for a parishioner whose husband died in irons. He doesn't announce it. He knows what it looks like to his deacons when church money goes out the door in that direction. Samuel Paris's maid, Tituba, walks out of jail only when someone pays her fees. She disappears into the record. The last line about her is a transaction, not a grave. The city moves on. A girl named Ruth Putnam grows into a woman who signs a public confession in 1706, saying that she lied, that she was deluded, that she asked forgiveness. People praise her courage. The families she named nod and go home to fences they didn't choose and fields they lost. Forgiveness doesn't move boundary stone. Think of the bodies cut down and put in crevices because no one would risk the fines for a proper burial. Think of the sons who dug at night to bring bones back to family ground. No keeper signed a receipt for that, but hands remembered. Dirt under fingernails doesn't wash off when apologies print. These aren't numbers. They're choices made in small rooms with bad light. Sell the heifer or see your son spend another week in irons, sign the quitclaim or lose the planting season, tell the truth and risk your own arrest or say what the magistrate needs to hear and walk home with a charge sheet in your pocket. Salem's cost wasn't abstract. It was counted in blankets, hammers, heifers, and sleep. And the bill came due, one household at a time. Resolution? What broke the spell, really? By the end, the machine didn't run out of rope, it ran out of consent. Doubt pushed from the edges to the center, and money headaches made certainty expensive. That's the real break. Belief loosened, politics flinched, and the cash logic lost its protective fog. Start with doubt. Clergy who had nodded at caution in June were now writing it plainly. Increase Mather's line, better 10 suspected escape than 1 innocent condemned, moved from a pamphlet to dinner tables. Jurors who had watched the afflicted mimic pinpricks began asking why every accusation came bundled with visions only a few could see. The Lord's Prayer at the gallows lingered. If a man could pray clean on the ladder and still swing, maybe the standard was crooked. That's not theology. That's an instinct for fairness, finally louder than fear. Then politics. The new charter's legitimacy was fragile. Phipps's governorship was shakier than his proclamations. The court he'd created became a liability when accusations brushed merchants with ships and touched his circle. He couldn't afford a tribunal that made the province look lawless to London or hostile to Boston's purse. Stoughton's resolve looked like recklessness. Phipps recalculated. Forbid spectral evidence, dissolve Oyer and Terminer, move what's left to a bench that demanded proof you could touch. The pivot wasn't piety, it was survival. Now the money. The jail economy depended on velocity, fresh warrants, new transports, diet tallies rolling, cut spectral testimony and the pipeline thinned. Confessions slowed, the circle of new names shrank, calendars opened. Sheriffs could still present bills, but fewer bodies meant fewer line items. The same officers who'd profited from volume now watched volume dip. Fees don't disappear when the product dries up, they just stop multiplying. In that pause, public patience returned. Meanwhile, petitions stacked. Families who had kept their heads down now signed for neighbors, and the colony's hunger for a fast moral drama waned as the costs landed. Mothers who had sold heifers to pay jail bread now pressed for reversals and restitution. The language turned from the devil's snares to administrative error, mistakes, misinterpretations, overreach. Government speaks that language when it plans to retreat without admitting motive. A few moments crystallized the turn. Philip English's case, with its intersection of wealth, church standing, and commercial ties, made the trials look less like cleansing and more like chaos touching capital. When capital complains, governors listen. And when the afflicted named a governor's wife, even as a rumor, it broke the trance that their visions were beyond question. Doubt was no longer brave, it was prudent. Inside courtrooms, you could hear the change in the questions. Magistrates asked for witnesses who'd seen acts, not specters. Juries hesitated at fits alone. Some who had confessed under pressure recanted when they realized the show was ending. Acquittals appeared where condemnations had been routine. The performance lost rhythm. That's how panics die. What nobody wrote into any final decree was the role of cash flow. When families began to resist fees, refusing to pay without receipts, petitioning for relief in the same breath as they begged for release, the office economy jammed. Keepers wanted guarantees, selectmen wanted order without a riot at the jail door. Slowing the tribunal was the cheapest way to lower the temperature. Clergy added a ritual seal to the shift. Public fasts, printed statements, careful mea culpas gave people language to stop. They didn't name the ledgers that had fattened in the frenzy. They didn't have to. People wanted an exit that left their neighbors alive and their consciences soothed. The colony stepped through it. The final stretch looked practical, not dramatic. Phipps halted the court that could kill with visions. A new court tried cases under stricter standards and found fewer witches. Pardons moved, jails emptied, bills did not. That's the split screen of the resolution, moral posture on one side, unpaid charges on the other. The spell broke because the story stopped paying. And under that, a quieter choice. Communities started choosing neighbors over narratives. Parish lines softened, committees let old rivals back in, marriages crossed the scar. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough to make accusation risky again. Once a village stops rewarding the language of possession with status and proximity to power, the voice loses its microphone. Accountability lagged, especially where assets had flowed fastest. Sheriffs kept what they'd converted, officers kept their pay, boundary agreements stayed set. The ledger didn't apologize, but the court did close, and the province relearned a rule older than any charter. When proof can't be checked and the bill keeps rising, the people eventually refuse to play. That's what broke the spell. Doubt armed with costs. politics afraid of its reflection, and a community deciding that living with each other was safer than living with a machine that needed more names. Salem ended not because the devil fled, but because doubt, politics, and unpaid bills finally outran a court built to monetize fear. That's the playbook. Revoke or weaken rules, lower proof in an emergency, monetize the process, move assets, then apologize without refunding. You'll recognize this rhythm in real time if you follow the money. If you want the receipts behind other monsters, subscribe and watch the next story. We'll trace the next panic back to a balance sheet. Share this with someone who buys the ghost tour and skips the ledger.